What we've got here today, we've just to let you know, around the corner there we've got the FX6 from Sony, and a big shout out to Lemac as well, who were fantastic supplying the camera kit and the tripod for us. They're my old company that I work for, and they're a fantastic team. So we've got a FX6 running into the new 27-inch up there, and that's running S-Log3 out, S-Gamut 3.Cine into a Rec 7, to a LUT that goes to Rec 709, a LUT that goes to PQ, and a LUT that goes to HLG as well. So to give you an idea of some poor man's monitoring on set for HDR, if you need to do that, that's what you would expect to get from a monitor that can get to 400 nits. And around the corner we've got, from my very good friend Dado, I've got his little Lightstream light kit, which is the one I carted, well, similar one I carted to Iceland with my daughter and son-in-law shooting ice caves in there. And this is the new 27-inch 4K, which is going to hit the market shortly. The CG series, and here the flagship area we've got the Prominence HDR monitor. So that's a true 1000 critical grading HDR monitor. And Warren's going to be doing his bit on that. And next to that we've got the 319, which is very popular in the post-production world. And this, we can show HDR and SDR side by side. A lot of people ask about that, and I'll talk about that a bit in the presentation. And also we can emulate a PQ curve as well for this. So you don't grade in HDR on this, but you can actually do some viewing, and you can do some practice work and poor man's HDR if you want. But the critical reference monitor is really the flagship one for doing any HDR work. So I just want to try and demystify, it's probably a bit of a strong word, but just to go through some of the HDR monitor technology which you're going to come across, because that's the big thing. How do I monitor on set in particular is always the hard one. How can I get a HDR monitor that I can afford for post-production? But just a few terms first. NIT, measure of luminance, you can see that on Warren's shirt. EOTF, just a fancy name for the old-fashioned gamma, but things have changed from the pure gamma curves with PQ and HLG. So that takes it out of resolve or baselight into your display, and this goes from your camera to your recording on your card. PQ, perceptual quantization, that's the ST2084, and HLG, the BBC NHK, which I've actually got a clip I uploaded last night as a bit of a test. Y is luminance, and if you see the Y dash, that's luma, which means it's got an EOTF applied to it. If you see some stuff that's got Y dash dash, that means it's got a HDR EOTF. So it's just if you're reading some stuff and you're trying to figure out what all these little terms mean, that's a bit of a guide. The thing about the HDR world is you start to interact with the human visual system, which is really cool. But it's got some nice things you need to be aware of as well. So this little graph here was put together by Ray Knight from work done in the 1940s about our way we see light. So in the Rec 709 world, it's been a bit of a doddle. And once we get to the HDR world, we start to interact more with our human visual system. So as brightness goes up, our ability to see a brightness range increases. But the interesting thing as well, within that brightness range, the slope here gets sharper or higher, which means our ability to discern differences in levels increases as brightness goes up as well. So when you're monitoring what you can get away with maybe in 709, if you've got some banding at 600 nits, you'll see it pretty obviously. So you need to be more careful about what you do and understand that you're starting to go and interact with your human visual system, and stuff that you wouldn't have seen in Rec 709 at 100, 120 nits or 200 nits, you'll start to see as that brightness level goes up. The eye will adapt to bright images fairly fast. You've all experienced this in your normal day-to-day life, but you need to think about this when you're cutting scenes together. But when you do that, the next dark scene will appear darker. Sudden dark to bright can hurt. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. The thing that people thought when HDR first came out, and started working on this in about 2014 with Roger Bunch from Free TV, was that everyone's going to have this 65-inch telly, 1000 nits. It's going to be like a floodlight lighting up your room. It's going to hurt your eyes. There's actually, the point source light is the thing that's the killer for your eyes and hurts people. So if you go from a black scene and you put a light like this, spotlight at 1000 nits, you'll do bad things to your audience. The other thing is sudden bright, so you can appear to lose detail as well. So in this shot here, what happens is you've got, this is from a shot from dado stuff, you might have a light coming through here. What happens is your eye will adapt to that bright light and then but appear to push those light levels down as well. So there's things that are going to happen into your eyes that you wouldn't have had it happen apparently with Rec 709. There is a document, BT2408 from the ITU. So the ITU documents are all free. And this document is an operational guide that was put together in conjunction with the BBC, a lot of work, and also Dolby for the PQ stuff. But the BBC came up with this little cheat sheet chart that if you go from 5 to 5 nits, that transition, it's all good. If you went from 5 nits to 320 nits, it's a horrible thing to do. So in that document, there's a lot of information on how they put together broadcasts for doing things like the Royal Wedding and the FIFA football, how they were doing HDR, SDR productions. Like, this is serious productions. This is not, you know, little things that they were putting together. As a sideline, when speaking with Andy Quested, when they did the Royal Wedding for Harry and Meghan Markle, that was the first time they did anything in HDR, and that went through a HDR to SDR LUT for 1.8 billion people. So it was a fairly significant work that was done to prove that was going to work. So that's a document, the ITU, if you're wanting to learn a little bit of HDR and operational stuff, they've got some good stuff, apart from the standard BT2100. The Stevens effect, contrast increases with luminance, which is what we saw there in that other chart. As that slope goes, as brightness goes up, our contrast increases. This one here, which I'll show a little chart, there's a common effect that the surround of a colour will affect its how you see it. The Hunt effect, this was mentioned yesterday, I think it might have been Pete, that as the luminance level goes up, the colour appears to be more colourful. And if you ever want to see an example of this, you can see this with Adobe RGB versus sRGB. So sRGB, the primary, for Adobe RGB and sRGB is exactly the same. The chromaticity points are identical. But when you go to Adobe RGB, the Adobe RGB red looks redder. And that's because the luminance level of that chromaticity point is slightly higher than sRGB. So your eye perceives it as being a more saturated red, when in fact it's not. And the Helmholtz-Kohlrausch effect. Brightness increases with saturation. So some really fun stuff that starts to happen with the human visual system when we start pushing it with our colour work. So this is that Bartels and Brennan. You can see here, this is a common illusion, if you like, but all these are exactly the same level. You put a colour picker on them, but depending on the surround, the apparent contrast changes depending on this surround. So when you go into a grading room, or if you're on set, and you're going to be looking and monitoring and making critical judgments, you need to be aware of your surround environment. For instance, on Elvis, they had a room which was totally saturated red or totally saturated blue. So people thought they would try and match their monitors by eye and change a few things because it didn't look right. So you have to be very aware that your eye will cheat and lie to you and it will adapt. It's far more complex than we know. But just be careful about what you do. So this is an interesting one. This guy, Steve Kuffler, in 1953, he's one of the world's prominent neurological people at that time. He did some experiments, and this is a retinal ganglion in your eyeball everyone's got. And what he found doing some experiments, that this cell has got two parts. It's got a center part which is sensitive, but a surround part which is an inhibitor. So if you look at this chart here, this is the time. This little light pulse here, this light coming through here, you get this as your neural response for your eye. But if you look at this one, it goes off. Your neural response, it just went through the roof. But as that light gets bigger, the neural response actually starts to come back down. And if you go to this, your neural response is almost zero. What in effect that does is that's like the titles that you might have as credits coming up on a black screen at 1000 nits. It will hurt your eyes. And that's what's happening. So in cinematography world, you need to be careful of point lights that you might get away with. You always have speculars and that, but those lights and how they're graded will affect your audience's viewing of your scene and also yours as well. But that is also apparent depending on the surround that you would have in your environment when you're viewing it. So for instance, on the little telly here, this is HDR set, but this can't get to 1,000 nits and the blacks are not black. So some content that you will see that hurt the eyes the other day that I had at home doesn't hurt the eyes here. So if you're grading on a monitor like that or a room environment like this, you might have some content you think is all fine and great, it doesn't hurt anybody's eye, but as soon as that content is seen in a proper viewing environment, things change dramatically. So you need to be really aware of the monitor and the viewing environment that you're starting to put this stuff together. What's HDR? It's high dynamic range. It's not about the brightness, especially if the cinematographers are here. Shadows have always been, probably in a lot of ways, more important. But it's the whole dynamic range of what we're talking about in terms of the light capture and the scene capture. The normal thing is 4K to 8K, but you can actually put HD, HDR. There's no rules saying you can't do that, but for delivery to the Netflix and stuff, it's always 4K. Wide gamut with a P3 gamut minimum, so no display can handle Rec 2020. So we use P3 as an interim format because all these monitors, well, all the critical monitors, can accurately show the P3 colour gamut. So if you see Disney, for instance, they have a Rec 2020, so it's P3 in a Rec 2020 container. That means you set your project at Rec 2020, but you limit the gamut within that Rec 2020 colour space to P3. HDR does not have blacker blacks than SDR. So when I go and calibrate the prominence over there, the black level at SDR is exactly the same as the black level at HDR. The black shadow details will change because of the PQ curve, but the actual black levels are identical. The black levels are determined by the display. It's not just about brightness, and this is probably the killer that where a lot of people go wrong is they try and make stuff too bright. It doesn't mean things should be more colourful. For instance, if you're shooting a Coca-Cola commercial, the red on a Coca-Cola bottle is the Rec 709 primaries or sRGB primaries. Bang on. If you get a spectra, I'll measure, go and get a Coca-Cola bottle from Woolworths or wherever, and measure it with a spectra, it'll come up Rec 709 red primary. And there's a reason for that, because it's the most saturated red they could get in a print and for normal television broadcast. So if you're shooting in a Rec 2020 gamut, that doesn't mean you make the Coca-Cola label redder. There'll be a lot of nasty emails coming around about that. So you need to be true to what you're doing. All you've got is an increased palette. So colours that are outside the Rec 709 colour gamut can be displayed correctly, for instance. And it is fantastic when it's done right. So we have two formats here, the PQ, which is the most common one people have been talking about because that's your Netflix, Disney streaming service. And then you've got HLG, the hybrid log gamma, which is the format developed by NHK and BBC. There's critical differences between the two. So the PQ is reference to a display of 10,000 nits. It's an absolute luminance format. We've never worked this way before in any of our content creation. But this is the critical key that you must understand when you're grading on a monitor and you're working with PQ. The other thing is it has metadata. In the hybrid log gamma, it's more like the Rec 709 world, where it's a relative format. HDR10 and 10 Plus and Dolby Vision, they're subsets really of in the PQ world, and we normally operate in full range. But this absolute luminance format and the metadata are the two key points you need to always remember. So you need to know what the luminance value of that monitor is when you're grading. You can't grade on a 500 nit telly and tell the system it's 1000, because this data is used by these TVs at home to then tone map down. So if you want your content to look correctly, you need to make sure this metadata is absolutely correct. Minimum requirements, black level of 0.005, peak wide of 1000, contrast ratio of 200,000 to 1, so it's just simply that divided by that, P3 colour space, and the surround extent luminance of 5 nits. So that's basically, the surround extent is when you're grading or when you're viewing stuff, so that's your monitor you're looking at. This is the surround extent behind the screen, and then outside of that should be 5 nits or less, and of course D65. I go into too many post houses and I see tungsten practicals or any other colour but D65 in a post house with their lights. You must pay attention to this because it will affect the way you see stuff. So even on set, if you had like Lumen where he had the Elvis thing come down, you see in the trailer with all the blue wash, like just massive blue, you can't then go and look at a screen and say, yeah, that looks good, because your eyes have adapted to that blue light. You need to give yourself a lot of time in a proper environment to adapt back. It's like going to the butcher and seeing the red sausages and stuff like that. It's no different for you guys. So how do we get to those specs? So you got the OLED. OLEDs are self-emitting. LCD, you control each pixel. So this is a dual layer LCD. The luminance, how hard can it be? It is actually really, really tough to make a proper HDR monitor, as everyone's found out. So you need to control heat and power. This is a big one. You need to control the color temperature. So when you go from black to white, you need to make sure it's D65 all the way through. And you need to control that grayscale through a very large range. So it needs to track correctly. To get a wide gamut, you need to have narrow primaries. There's some issues with P3 and Rec 2020, they're not aligned, I won't go into that sort of stuff. But you start to get some metamerism issues as well, which you've had with the PVM Sony OLEDs and the Flanders. Anyone who used the RGB OLED, you measure D65 and they look slightly green. So we've had a perceptual match for that for even in the SDR world. So there's some interesting stuff we play with.
Excuse me, what is metamerism?
Metamerism is when you see a colour under one light source and you go and see it another looks different. So if you go and buy a dress in a store and it's a nice shade of blue, and you go outside and it looks slightly cyanish. So your eye's perception changes. So what we're doing here with this display, so this is the Sony OLED. I haven't got the colour matching functions here, but they're very sharp peaks. So that interacts with your eyeballs, which have got cones in them. So they've got a long, medium and short wavelength. No, there's mapping that. So you've got to basically match that to your eyeballs, and your eyes have to adapt. So instead of seeing, even though we measure on a spectro and our mathematics is this and all that sort of thing, it's not perfect by a long way. It doesn't account for some of these issues. So there's a thing called a Judd offset, which was a colour scientist in the 1950s. And he created a little offset to try and make a better colour matching function. So we've got all these different displays and different light sources. And that spectral response, how we perceive that spectral response, can vary depending on that source of light. So it's amazing that you can have, so this is a white LED, and that will look pretty well D65. This PSF wide gamut is one of these fellas here. So it's got sharp blue, your green, and a really spiky red. That spiky red allows you to get the DCI P3 primary, which is right, almost achromatic on the locus. This is the new JLED. So you can see this is an RGB OLED as well. The old PVM, Sony Flanders with that. But you can see the response is different. So that will need a perceptual match as well to perceive them as being white to our eyeballs. So the only way you can measure those is to use one of those. That's a spectro. So anyone's got an i1 Pro 2 or a Pro 3 and you're going to try and measure this accurately, you can forget it. You need at least a 4 nanometer spectro or better. This is an optical 2 nanometer with a spectral resolution of 0.8. That's a CR300 from Calibration Research. That's a $25,000 probe. So they're very expensive toys to play with. But that's the sort of kit we use to make sure that what we're doing is correct. So when you calibrate a monitor. So these different spectral responses is when you get different, you might have a PVM OLED, you might have an LCD, you might have an old one you've dug out of the thing which has got a fluoro backlight, and you want to colour match all those monitors. And you want to have all look perfectly exactly the same. This is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with this spectral response working with your eye, this spectral response working with your eye, this one working with your eye, and you want to make them all look the same. So that's basically metamerism, as we can actually match those colours and our eye will perceive them to be the same. It's pretty cool. So the native P3 gamut you can see here, that's the PVM type spectral response. So its green primary is over here, there's DCI P3. So this can never ever display those colours because this is the primaries. That determines what you can actually see. This is a PSF phosphor, and you can see it's almost up the line from red to green on the DCI P3. Of course, it goes beyond that, and it goes to blue, and it's bigger than the red. So it covers DCI P3 pretty well, 100%, except for this very small line up here, but it's basically below the perceptible limits of us humans. That's the JOLED. So the JOLED, you can see the JOLED, that different spectral response. If I can go back, I'm not going to go back for some reason, but anyway, it was over here. So that different spectral response means these primaries are in a slightly different spot. So it's better for DCI P3 display. The low cost, everyone wants the HDR monitor to be low cost. How hard can it be? This is what the problem is. So remember, we're talking about, you need to know that your monitor is correct. If you're going to make critical decisions, you need to make sure that you can trust what you're seeing. So this is the problem with the dimming. So the X300 from Sony, the old OLED, it did the reverse. It couldn't show a full white at 1,000 nits, but nobody ever really did that. It could show a small patch window, I think at 10 or 20% at 1,000 nits. So it was, for speculars and stuff, was fine. But the LCDs are the opposite. They can show 1,000 nits full screen, but they can't show small patches. So think of a white car going along a road. That's a small white patch. So at 60%, that luminance level starts to dim down. And you're getting down to like 550 or something like in this situation. So, and that will be variable depending on the APL content. So you might have a white car, as that background content is changing, this level of luminance will also change. But one of the worst things with some of the cheaper HDR screens is that the actual colour temperature shifts with patch size. So this is just a black screen, white window, making it bigger and smaller. So you've calibrated 1,000 nits, and as that patch gets smaller, the colour of that white changes. And at 10%, it's like way, way off. So when you go and do a critical monitor, no matter what the patch size is, no matter what the content is, I want it to stay correct. Otherwise, you can't trust your monitor. You can get some other artifacts like posterization, the dimming. As stuff moves in and out of dimming zones, it can also change depending on how good the dimming algorithm is. So obviously the better monitors are far better at that. This is around about a $10,000 monitor. So you can see also here the luminance local dimming, depending on the surround. So I changed the background surround from grey at 25, 50 and 75%, so that level changes. So the story is that you don't know what the actual true luminance level is, therefore you don't know what the true exposure is as well, which is what that luminance level is. WOLEDs, which is the LG, which I've got one at home, they're fantastic. For SDR, you can calibrate them really well. But for HDR, the RGB runs out of steam at 400 nits. Now they do mapping and all the rest of it, but again, up in this area above here, it's really just the white pixel is working. So that's why you can't use them for critical grading. They are a really, really good client monitor. And in SDR, they're a fantastic client monitor because you can calibrate them with a 3D LUT. The LG one you can. If you've got a Sony or a Samsung, you need to use a LUT box. So for critical viewing, you can't use those. For critical grading as well, that's a no-go.
Oh, no, you just upset some people there, mate.
Well, I can't know, but that's the truth. They're great, but they do change. They're a consumer telly. Yeah. Like mine at home started 6 months ago. It was all white across it, beautiful, and now it's starting to get a slight cyan to magenta tinge across it. So, but but for normal viewing for home, it's fantastic. But for critical colour grading, it's not as a reference, as a client monitor, they're fantastic. The old BVMX 300, which was the first one to come out, it did dimming, but as I mentioned before, but speculars are okay. It's discontinued. Dual layer is the current reference monitor. So there's our monitor there, the Prominence CG3146, the Sony HX310, TV Logics and Postum. They all use the dual layer panel, but that's just the panel. Then there's the electrics and the stuff that go behind that to make that panel work, which is the differentiator between the two, between all those brands. And dimming in the high end, Flanders is a dimming, Canon and TV Logic. So TV Logic have an entry level expensive HDR and a premium dual layer one.
What does dual layer mean?
Okay, so in to get the blacks in an LCD, so an LCD works by having so a backlight is on all the time. And the LCD crystals, as the electrical signal says, you know, I'm a dark image, I'm a light image, will shut the light on and off. The trouble is with a normal LCD, and you can see that here, that black is not really black. There's always a little bit of light bleed coming through. So in simple terms, a dual layer means there's two LCD panels working in conjunction with each other. So I can turn the light off totally to make the blacks totally black, like an OLED. So the black on this fella here measures about 0.0005. That one there is probably running at about 0.1, something like that. So this monitor here is about, not at the moment, it's running in HDR mode or SDR?
SDR.
SDR? No, it's running in PQ.
On input 2, yeah?
Yeah, so but anyway, so that's running about 0.2 of a nit there, because this is running in a PQ curve at 300 nits. So that dual layer is a very expensive way to shut light and control light, but what it does allow you to do, you don't have dimming zones. So dimming zones means as you split the screen into, say, 1,000 zones, as objects move from one zone to another, you can see halo effects. There's some of them have some really bad effects. So with those, there's no dimming zones per se, because every pixel is a dimming zone. So you don't get the halo effect, get much more control. It doesn't matter if the image is a full white or a pinprick of light, it'll still be 1,000 nits, and tracks the gamut as well. So it's a pretty advanced technology, and it's why it's so expensive. So this is the Prominence here. So it's a 32-inch, it's a DCI 4K. So I measure that with my colorimeter. That thing can go down to 0.407, I think it is, of a nit. So these are highly accurate NIST certified probes. So it has at least 2 million to 1, 12G SDI, HDMI, obviously wide gamut. And it's got a built-in colorimeter too, which is unusual for this level. It's the only one that can do it. So ASO, all these monitors here have their inbuilt colorimeter, and ASO build their own colorimeters. And so this won the Academy Award for Science and Technology Award. And so you can go and correlate that as you can all the other probes. So I can correlate the internal colorimeter in here to a CR300, which makes that colorimeter then really, really accurate. Because all colorimeters need to be matched to a spectro to be accurate. So you can connect that to Color Navigator 7, ASO's calibration software, and you can calibrate that to HDR. So all the reports that I've got on my website, on the ASO website, have been calibrated using the internal probe, correlated to the CR300, verified by the CR100, matched to the CR300, using color space as an independent party. So when you get that from us, it comes to me first. I calibrate all the slots, produce a report, make sure it's all fine and dandy. All the monitors are calibrated out of the factory, but that one gets extra special treatment. So this is the example of 3146, just as a quick profile. This is using the EBU HDR test pattern. So the green dots mean that their delta E error is less than 1. They're totally imperceptible. So you get this sort of report. We also show the report as a 3D volume because colour is three-dimensional. So we look at the whole colour volume as well. So I quite often do far more than just the 70-odd colours. I'll do a 1,000 patch run. So this is using the inbuilt probe and verified with the CR100 to show you what you actually do truly get. And then there's the tracking. So in the HDR monitor, you need to track from 0.005 of a nit all the way through to 1,000 and do it completely accurately. So it's very, very difficult, and it takes a lot of engineering to do that. So they have got 24-bit LUTs to do that correction. And that's the delta E run. Shows it's less than 1 all the way across the colour volume. So in this one, the simultaneous HDR SDR, a lot of people ask for this. I'm not a fan of it. And the reason I'm not a fan of it is because you've got a really bright type monitor next to an SDR monitor, and your eyes will always adapt to the brighter one. But people want to do it, and I can see it. So we've got it here today, so you can see what this is actually a.
300 nits at the moment.
Yeah, this is a PQ because it's emulation. Yeah. So we can set the resolve up to do a HDR, showing the HDR, and then showing the tone mapped SDR. So you can get a feel if that's what your workflow you think you might like to do. Then you can actually see it here live, and you can have a play with it and see how you feel. But this is a normal setup that we've got here running SDI, because you take A and B out and then into the 319. If you have, so I was at a post house in Brisbane last week, and they had a HX310 with a dual layer, and they had a VVM OLED. So in this case here, I can set this for D65 and that D65, and they match perfectly. But if you've got two different display technologies, then you need to perceptually match those before you even start. So you can't go and measure this for D65, that D65, and then put content up and have a look at it. You need to perceptually match this white to your master. Then you measure that chromaticity that you've calibrated. So up there we got the colorist to go and match the white to the white, measure that chromaticity point, create a new color space, and calibrate to that new color space. So those two monitors were matched before we even started looking at content. Because if you don't do that, the content will look wrong to your eye. So you have to be careful about when you go into that, what display they've got. They need to be highly accurately calibrated, and if they're different technologies, they need to be perceptually matched. And you need to choose which one's your master and which one's your reference. Normally you would choose that as your master, of course.
They had a client monitor in there as well? Or not?
It wasn't on, no.
Oh, but in theory you'd have 3, wouldn't you? You'd have a client one as well.
Oh, yeah, if you wanted to, if you wanted to, yes, you could. So in that way, you would have to then probably perceptually match all 3, depending. But what they were doing was in this situation here, where they were looking at the HDR grade to the SDR and how it was going to go. So they were looking at, making sure that they were happy with the grade and how the grade and SDR was going to go.
Yeah, not necessarily have clients at that stage.
They didn't have clients, but they were doing that thing. Before you have a client in, you need to do this.
Oh, yeah.
You need to test.
Yeah,
You,
I'm not a fan of both either.
but anyway, but people want to do that. I said you can come here and have a look and see for your own eyes what it actually looks like. So at the moment in this, we've got a perceptual view. So this is set for a PQ curve, but it clips at 300, which is the maximum luminance level this can do. But then in an LCD, the LCD, when you lift up the brightness level, the black level comes with it and tracks up and down. So this would be normally about 0.07 of a nit at 100 nits. But as you lift up that black level, lift up the brightness, and the black level will go up with it as well. So, and that's why on set you see they call them HDR, but really they're high brightness monitors. They're not true HDR monitors. But this is the critical component here. If you're going to be trying to match and have a look at shots side by side with SDR and HDR, you need to, before you even start, you need to make sure that your 2 monitors are matched perceptually. Just a little bit of onset. You can't use dimming it to check exposure because you have no idea what the dimming algorithm is doing. So if you're going to try and set the exposure level and use that as some sort of large viewfinder, which a lot of DOPs have done in the past with Rec 709 and the PVMs, in the world of HDR, if your monitor's dimming, you don't know what that dimming algorithm is doing. The room environments, they're critical. People ignore this far, far too much. And in HDR, you need to be even more cognizant of the fact that there are differences. But even in SDR, I'd like $1 for every time someone said the monitor is clipping blacks and they're in a normal office room running a monitor 2.4 gamma set correctly. And when you tell them to turn the lights down and dim it and get a proper room, suddenly those shadow details come to life. Or every post suite I go into, the brightness on an OLED PVM has been turned up. And when you do that, you then change the tracking of the gamma curve. So your shadows changes as well. So there's ramifications on getting into the knobs on the telly and going, I think that looks right. I think that looks right. Don't do it. If you're not sure, get a probe, measure it, set your room environment, get a little spectro. If you've got an I1D3, which I didn't bring down with me, but you can go and use the I1D3 to measure ambient light as well as luminance. It's quite a good little thing. Or you can get an I1 Studio, like they're $700. And there's a program from a guy called Graham Gill called Argyle Pro, which I've got on my phone. And that will then allow you to use that as a light meter. But if you've got a light meter that can do incident reflected light, you can also use that as well. The HDR onset is a guide only, and I reckon HLG is probably a good idea to look at. So you can see over there on that screen, you can see the HLG versus the PQ on not a true HDR monitor, but it'll give you an idea as a cinematographer or color graders where you're working. And I said we can get to 300 nits with what we're showing here. And it's going to be useful to check the exposure level, and the gamut will obviously be correct as well. In the calibration, matrix and linearity, so all ASO monitors are like that, so they're totally linear. You'll find that quite a few monitors which are not so good will have a display. So those red are really bad errors and the orange are sort of okay. But to calibrate this monitor, you need to use a 3D LUT, because a 3D LUT can correct non-linearities in the color volume. In this monitor here, you can use a matrix. So a matrix is just a number cruncher. It just says take the primaries from here and put them down to here. So I said there's 3D LUT and 1D LUT matrix. So the 1D LUT does your tone curve, and the matrix can only be used if you've got an extremely linear monitor. If you don't, you'll never correct the color volume. So in other words, if you've got a Samsung client monitor, for instance, or even an LG C1, you have to use a 3D LUT with a client monitor. Forget trying to tweak the internal CMS of those, because you can make the primaries sort of measure okay, but when you go and have a look at a Granger Rainbow test pattern, it'll be clipped, the colours will be distorted, it'll destroy the colour volume. So your primaries might measure okay, but you put someone's face up there and it'll look very horrible. So any client monitor on set that doesn't have 3D LUT capabilities, that's non-linear, you need to use a LUT box. They're cheapest chips, like you can get the Blackmagics for like $280 or something like that. And it's actually faster to calibrate with a LUT box than it is to tweak the CMS controls and try and get it right. Especially if someone's got colour space, which I've got. I can do a small profile with colour space, and I can create a LUT very, very fast in those, because the engine works pretty well. If it's a really bad non-linear, then you need to do a big patch profile. So if you've got a JVC projector, God forbid, I've had the misfortune of having to do 2 of them so far, you need to do a full 5,000 patch run, because you need to get as much data as you can, because they're pretty horrible. But the matrix cannot correct non-linearities, which is what you're trying to do when you go and work the CMS controls on a monitor or anything like that. So with the ASO, they're very, very, very linear. Even the GUIs, flex scans, they're extremely linear. So Color Matrix, Color Navigator 7, that does a 1D LUT and a matrix. So all those reports that I've got, you can see those reports, the final results, are all done using that method, and they can do that because the linearity of their monitor is extremely well. Same as a DCI projector in a theatre. They just do the primaries and the white point. Mentioned all this. The HDR calibration, you do require more attention. Mainly that you need to go and allow the monitor to go and settle at its operating temperature. Because once you go into HDR mode, the operating temperature of the monitor increases quite a lot. Now the ASO monitors have a lot of AI in them to keep them stable. But before you do critical measurements, you need to give a little bit of time to settle down from one mode to another. Probes and spectro. So a spectro such as this fella here, he's extremely accurate, but he's really, really slow. Like it can take 5 seconds to read a patch. So you don't use those for profiling. What we use those for is to create offsets to correct the colorimeter for all those different display technologies. So if you've got an i1 Pro 2, you don't use that for profiling, slow, thermal drift, all that sort of stuff. The other thing about those with these sort of monitors, the PSF style, not just ASO, but any brand that uses that wide gamut type monitors, the i1 Pro 2 is not accurate enough. You'll kid yourself with your readings. The OLED it works okay for generally, because it's not a spiky red that you get with the PSF. And for the PSF, you need to have a 4 nanometer, which can be a Jetty, the CR250, which is the cheaper version of that from Colorimetry Research. So there's a few of them around, but they are expensive. There's no doubt about that. But if you want accuracy, then you need to use the kit to get accuracy. Same thing if you want to shoot on a Lexus 65, you don't put a Samyang lens on the front of it. You've got a spider, throw it in the bin. The i1 Pro, i1D3 is actually a good little probe, and it's the best of the low-cost options. So you can use it to measure ambient light, and you can measure it to measure luminance. But you need to probe match it for accuracy. The EDRs are not accurate enough. So this, what they do in X-Rite, they do them in large batch runs, and they'll put the spectral data of this batch in there. But every measurement I've done, testing the EDRs, comparing it back to here, the accuracy is not what I would think accurate enough. So if you're running colour space, for instance, which I run, then you can go and match that i1D3 to a high-end spectro, which suddenly changes the life of that little i1D3 to be accurate. But just because you measure it to be D65 doesn't mean it is. It depends on the probe accuracy. There's different models, OEM, retail, manufacturers. So for instance, if you buy the Calman C6, it'll only work with Calman. The OEM won't work with X-Rite software, not that you would want to use X-Rite software because it's pretty bad. The retail can work with Calman or Colour Space, lockout limits. They both can do HDR, even though one says I'm certified. They're basically exactly the same probe, and they'll do HDR for you. But you need to, if you've got one of those fellas, you need to probe match it if you think you're going to be trying to do accurate calibration. There ain't no ifs or buts about that. In the reference probes, CA210, 310, they're not HDR. The 410 is really expensive. And then the Klein 10 and the CR100, they're both the common probes you'd find, and the choice is yours. I've got the CR100, but both of those probes are the industry standard, if you like. And that's it from me. So I hope that wasn't too heavy, first thing in the morning on Saturday.
Good job that wasn't the last one.
Well, it probably is, but it's important. So you need to know what your monitor is. You can't kid yourself. If you're going to, especially in PQ, if you're going to grade in PQ and make decisions in PQ, you need to know what the monitor is, because it's an absolute nit format. Then learn this language.
Has anyone got questions? I've got one.
Yep.
Who decided PQ should be a 10,000 nits?
Dolby. So Dolby invented PQ.
Yeah.
So it was, then they gifted it to SMPTE, and that became a standard called ST2084. So what they did was they got two very, very large projectors to simulate 10,000 nit and did all their tests. You can read that, I think, in one of those ITU documents, I think.
It was 21,000 people they tested.
Yeah, so...
10,000 what? 21,000 what was?
Yeah, so, but the whole thing is, So no display can get to 10,000. So the idea is that was for speculars, right? For like stuff off cars and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And if you read back, even dealing with them in the early days of putting 2100 together, from their point of view, the main content was exactly the same as SDR. It was only for speculars. But once people got their hands on it, they went, whoo, look at this. But they didn't also have reference monitors to see really what was happening to their eyes. So you'll find now that things are starting to settle back down because people were making stuff too bright. They weren't paying attention to the human visual system, and particularly if they were working in HDR and they were working, say, on a monitor like this or a monitor like this that couldn't do the at least 1000 nits, they just had their waveform monitor looking like a Rec 709 waveform monitor. So like where you'd normally have, say, 65% of skin tones, 60% or 55, wherever you want to sit them, like that's 600 nits or something like.
Yeah.
They didn't understand how to read a waveform monitor in the PQ world. So there's a lot of issues about that. So now you've got the Dolby have brought out and broken their own PQ by having the Dolby I/O, because people's rooms in their house, they don't have the room level set correctly. So it's a hard thing to try and get the world people to go and set their room level correctly.
Dolby said, well, if you're making a Dolby Vision an ASC, you've got to be on 4,000 on a pulsar, didn't they? So people used to do a trim, they used to work on their X300.
Yeah, well, that was from the very, very start. There was only the Dolby pulsar. Yeah. That was the only monitor that existed in the world. That only existed in Dolby. But there was always the tone mapping, because they always had the ECMU. So if you look at my paper, which was written in 2015, 2016, that was part of the BT 2100 contribution from Australia. I hadn't seen any of this. This was just what Dolby said. And they had this ECMU and tone mapping. Now, I was very dubious about it, but it was always, the tone mapping was always there. They always knew that there was no monitor with 10,000 nit. So they always knew there was going to be tone mapping and how that was going to work within the system. So that wasn't sort of introduced later. And that's why the metadata was part of that, always part of the original gig with Dolby, because that metadata told the monitor at the receiving end what I was graded on and what I can do. So if you look at, I've got it on another slide here, so I can pull out the LG, for instance. When you go and calibrate that, you measure the maximum luminance it can do and look at its roll-off. So it says you would mask it on a 1000 nit telly. I'm a 700 nit telly. So so therefore I know what to tone map, because they've got their own internal algorithm to do that. And then they'll also do roll-offs as well. So again, if you're going to grade in PQ, you do hard clip, you don't do roll-offs, but you can create LUTs to simulate what it would look like at home, but you certainly hard clip here. But the tone mapping was always part of that Dolby Vision ecosystem, and it is the most critical component. You must pay attention to your resolve settings before you even do anything. You need to set what the project is. You need to determine whether I'm going to be operating in a P3 space purely like Netflix, or whether I'm going to be operating in a Rec 2020 space with a limited gamut of P3, which is the Disney workflow. And you don't change project settings halfway through, because even though technically they should be identical, the actual algorithms in Resolve, for instance, will actually do colour shifts. So once you're down this path, you continue that path. You don't want to change ship halfway through.
So for anyone who doesn't have how much, 30,000?
We've got it's one for 30 or two for 70.
Yeah, so you can come up and pay us if you want one. Now this guy is
Yeah, about that.
SDR,
Yeah.
so you can get 300 nits out of it. So what we're showing here is this in the 300 nit mode in PQ, but you can obviously see you're losing your highlight. You're losing anything over 300 nits. So there is this 1000 emulation.
Yeah. Down to colour. Yeah. Then down to.
In here, so you've got this clipping mode. So we can go in there, and you can go through, go to 1000,
and you get the highlights back.
and it's pretty good in here to be able to go there and check your highlights. So obviously you could do your pass. You're knowing you're losing that information. Switch this, come through, check your highlight information, for a lot of ways for 7,000, then
So I always say also, if you're going to be doing this sort of stuff, on your resolved scopes, put a reference line at 300 so you can see what in the content is above 300, so what you're going to expect. So it's a bit like if anyone used an F65, you had the high key and the low key. You could change the LUT so you could check the highlight detail on F65 to see you weren't clipping, and you could have a look at the shadow detail.
cool, mate. Any other questions for Stuart before you guys can get up and have a play and walk around, stretch your legs?
Only you spoke a lot about what the back end, but what about when you're actually on the field and you're moving around and you've got your monitors in one space and then you're going outdoors and that's
You can't.
You don't have this ideal.
No, that's
and
right.
I can't get a
So that's where you have to probably trust your cinematography skills with light meters and stuff like that. So I've got that emulation up the back there, but the cold hard facts are that if you've got a monitor out in full daylight sun, even though it might be 1,000 nits, you might have a wraparound hood so you're in a dark environment, but even then you'd have to allow your eyes to adapt. So there isn't any solution as such to go and, but even in the SDR world in Rec 709, even though you might have a high brightness monitor, I can tell you none of those high brightness monitors tracked correctly the colour temperature and stuff like that when you went from 100 nits to 1,000 nits, because I've done a lot of them. So you're the same mentality, I guess, is there as well. But what you can do is you can check things whether maybe you're clipping or stuff, but colour, no. But you're shooting in log anyway, really. So as long as you're...
Yeah, but you would usually be displaying probably your LUTs on your on-set monitor.
Yeah, so which is what I've got up there.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm doing. So in that we've got a S-Log3 to S-Gamut3.cine to Rec 709, which is your normal day-to-day stuff you've been using now. That's a technical LUT. That's not a graded LUT to go and say, I want it to look like this. That was created in Wonderlook Pro. Then I've got the same thing, S-Log3 to a PQ LUT, so on a different slot. That monitor gets to about, I think it was 331 or something, I forget exactly now. That's a technical LUT that was created in colour space. And that's got a highlight roll-off I put in there as well, because that technical LUT in its pure form is like really savage, not what you'd use for on-set. And then there's a LUT that's S-Log3 to HLG, which is why I think HLG is probably maybe a good working environment for on-set, because you're not worrying about pure luminance level clips. So if that monitor is set for 300, it's going to clip for 300. HLG is a relative format, the same as Rec 709. The difference is that HLG has a 2.4 gamma curve to 60%. Then it uses log encoding from 60 to 100%. So it works in percent in not nits. So you don't clip at 100 nits in Rec 709, because it can be 120, it can be 125, you don't care. Your clip level is dependent on your code value. In this world here, your clip levels depend on your nit value. So they're two different ways of thinking. That's why I thought, I've been looking at HLG more and more, and I think the more I look at it, the more I'm coming to the view that for a lot of this work, it's a good option to actually see the entire range of your content within the limits of your display, and it'll be mapped within that. So if I'm looking at HLG on that and it's showing clipping, I can pretty well say that the camera's clipping. So it's a bit, I mean, it's like looking at sort of a log, but it's obviously transformed into that. So that's why I'm sort of going, HLG's been underdone a lot. And maybe the BBC and NHK had something in there. So, and there's no reason why, it doesn't, because I'm monitoring HLG doesn't mean it's going to upset the PQ project, because that's all going to be done in post. What you're looking at on set is to make sure that, what's the general look of it? Am I clipping? Is the composition correct? And all that sort of stuff. I mean, you've got tools within your cameras, false colours and array and stuff like that, which you should be using. But for on set, the same rules apply, but I think maybe the HLG, I mean, my thoughts on this are only probably a couple of weeks old, so I'm still working around it, but I'm just looking at more and more that I think the HLG for, and if you don't have one of those guys on set, could be a really good way to look at HDR and get a feel for the shot.
Yeah,
You know,
I agree. Actually, I was using a funny, weird setup the other day, which had a monitor and gave me those options of lights, and I did actually choose the HLG because I felt like it gave me the
Yeah.
best sense of
because it's not clipping to a specific
the
nit
range
value.
I had and whether my whites were holding.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's it's something you should test and work with. There's no, you know, I'm no oracle to say this is the way you should do things. It's personal, but it's a solution which has been ignored, me included, to be honest with you. I mean, you know technically what it does and all the rest of it, but say even with HLG, if you get that BT2408 document, and there is a lot of stuff in there that's math and stuff, but there's a really bucket load of useful information like that cheat sheet transition chart that the BBC put together. But the thing with HLG is that depending on the luminance capability of the monitor, you can change the system gamma so monitors can perceptually look the same. So in that monitor over there, for these, which can do, I think it can do up to 400, but call it 350. Then you set the system gamma in HLG to say 1, and the system gamma in HLG for here would be 1.2 because that's 1,000 nits. So perceptually, the tonal range looks the same. So it's quite cool in that. So that's something you have to, if you're going to do HLG, you need to be aware of the system gamma thing, which is not a big deal. It's just a selection setting on the monitor. I can show people that up in that monitor there. But that system gamma allows you to have a 400 or a 600 or a 1000 or 2000 nit monitor perceptually look similar. I'm not going to say look the same, but look similar. But for a cinematographer, I think that's a good thing. But you need to go and look at that system gamma. That's the only thing. But I said that BT2408 is a fantastic document. It shows you the entire HDR, SDR broadcast setup that they were doing for things like FIFA. But it'll also, even though you're cinematography and you're not doing, you know, live football, it will show you the mentality of how things were tracking between HDR and SDR, which they talk about a lot. So, and in a lot of ways their gig is harder because, you know, you can't go and replay the World Cup or you can't get Harry, you know, oh, Eric, can you just go and do this walk by again, mate? You know, we've just, the LUT's wrong. It's,
can't we replay the Euros, Luciano? Peter Harrow, how many monitors did you have on Lord of the Rings?
We had, DIT-wise, we had 3 monitors, 2 SDR and 1 HDR.
Yeah.
Video-wise, we had 14 out and around the set. Yeah. And then dailies, we had 2.
And they all matched perfectly, didn't they?
Let's not go there.
well, Lumen up there, no, not Lumen, what's the latest one they're doing up there now? Not Lumen's,
the
Nautilus. Yeah, so he had, what did he have? In that day I did 16 PVMs between 17 and 25s. We had Convision, we had Flanders, and they were Rebel fleets. And what else did he have? What else did Pete bring? He had another Rogue one come in. So they all matched up pretty well. But Elvis one, we had sat in the grading room, and we had the CM250s, DM250s, PVM A250s, and the LG OLED for Mandy's thing, and 3 of them looking like this. On the shots that they were producing out of there with Tom Hanks's face, which was a saturated blue light with a red wash on it at about 0.1 of a nit. And they want them absolutely, they did, they actually looked, I was amazed. Even the OLED was pretty bloody good after we put a LUT box on it.
All right.
But yeah.
Thanks, buddy. Just quickly, before a break, we'll be back on at 11:30. Please come up, look at these. That one is the new 4K, isn't it?
That's the 4K?
SDR, but 300 nits out of that as well, yeah?
Yep, correct. It's actually a bit more, I think it's about, gets up to 400.
Yeah. All right, so feel free to help yourselves to water, cold drinks, bickies, coffee. Your best bet is over the road for a warm drink back at 11:30 with the Rebel fleet. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you.